Good morning and welcome to our adult Bible study here at St. John's Episcopal Church in Laurel, Mississippi on this, the 30th of June, otherwise known as the sixth Sunday after Pentecost, in which we are looking at the lessons for Proper 8 in Liturgical Year B. And as you know, once we get past Trinity Sunday, we have options between Track 1 and Track 2. Track 2, the Old Testament reading is, like in the old prayer book lectionary, more allied to what's going on in the lesson from the Gospel. We default to Track 2 in this parish, and so our Old Testament reading is actually from the Apocrypha. It is from the Wisdom of Solomon. Now, I might point out that the program for today, the Mass booklet for today, actually has that wrong. It refers to this as being a lesson from wisdom. Wisdom and Wisdom of Solomon are two separate books that get confused all the time. Wisdom is otherwise known as the Book of Wisdom of Jesus ben Sirach, and so you will sometimes see it referred to as Sirach in some Bible translations. Wisdom of Solomon is a completely different book. And of course, they both are related in a certain sense to Proverbs and to Ecclesiastes. Proverbs and Ecclesiastes are in the Bible, and they are all part of what is a genre in the ancient Near East that is called wisdom literature. And we have it in the Bible, we have it in Egyptian wisdom literature, Babylonian wisdom literature. The basic idea behind wisdom literature is expressed in Psalm number 1, which a lot of the Psalms are wisdom literature, and that says, "Blessed is the man who has not sat in the counsel of the wicked, but who has sought the way of the Lord. He's like a tree planted by streams of living water." There are two pathways you can follow in life: the path of folly, which is your own, or the path of the Lord, which is the path of wisdom. Now we know in Proverbs, for example, that wisdom gets personified as being present with God immediately at creation, given a female pronoun incidentally, as wisdom who is personified clearly in the Bible, not God. And so people who argue that this is somehow the Holy Spirit aren't really paying attention. But Wisdom of Solomon is found in the Apocrypha. Now, the Apocrypha is really just those books in the Old Testament, Greek version of the Old Testament, that get taken out by the Protestant reformers. You have to remember that when people are writing the New Testament, there is no other scripture. They have what we would now call the Old Testament. They just call Tanakh, the scriptures, which has the law, the prophets, and the writings, which would include wisdom literature. The New Testament writers, when they are quoting from what we now call the Old Testament, are generally quoting from the Greek text, the Septuagint, which was a translation of the Bible into Greek made in the 2nd century before Jesus in Alexandria, Egypt, what was then the largest Greek-speaking city in the world, by a group of 72 scholars. And they would look at the Proto-Hebrew, the old scrolls, like similar to what we'd call the Dead Sea Scrolls now, and say, how do we render this into the Greek, right? Septuagint, you'll see it abbreviated in scholarly literature as LXX, the number 70 in Latin, is a reference to the 72 translators. Why they rounded to 70, I don't know. But at any rate, we have this in the Apocrypha, and what our prayer book tells us in the Articles of Religion is that they are of use for example of life, and yet doth not establish any doctrine. To be technical, if you're the lector and you are closing the lesson from the Apocrypha, you do not say the word of the Lord. You say, here ends the lesson. And we only get lessons from the Apocrypha about 2 or 3 times a year, so this is usually not something that anybody remembers. But as I say, we have to distinguish Wisdom of Solomon from Sirach, which is often referred to as the Book of Wisdom. Uh, the original of Wisdom of Solomon was written in Greek. It wasn't translated from Hebrew. And that's how things ended up in the Apocrypha. If they were originally written in Greek, the Protestant reformers took them out of the Bible. And so if you look at an Orthodox or Roman Catholic Bible, you see there's like an extra chapter of Daniel in there. That's because there's an extra chapter in Greek, in the Septuagint. That one comes out, and we get it in the Apocrypha as Susanna or Bel and the Dragon. Here we have wisdom also reflecting what we would call a Neoplatonic worldview, because we're talking about early Alexandria. Well, not really early by Alexandrian standards, but early for us. We're talking about before Jesus in northern Egypt. The purpose of the book here is to strengthen faith amongst Greek-speaking Jews living in Alexandria. And wisdom is defined as right living, following God's law. Immortality is the reward here for following God's law. So you could say that immortality is the reward for wisdom. And so the book begins with an exhortation to justice, and then starts talking about death. The death, which the author refers to here, is not physical death, but spiritual death. The physical world around us does not have the capacity to cause spiritual death because righteousness is immortal. But we see all the time things that look like spiritual death in this world, do we not? And so we have to reframe things into a different frame of reference and say, those who are not believers are perceived by believers as spiritually dead. The question becomes, will this be their eternal fate or not? And we can't judge that. The wicked, in effect, invite this spiritual death in the view of Wisdom of Solomon here. The wicked espouse a functional atheism in which the human condition is defined to be the result of chance. Now, we have to be careful here. An atheist says what? There is no God, there is no supernatural, etc., etc. Most of what we encounter in a worldview is functional atheism, which is to say, I live as if there is no God. It's all random, right? And I make my own rules, and to the extent that I observe society's rules, it's sort of a power hierarchy thing, and we can go to the extent of being deconstructionists and arguing like Michel Foucault that all language is an exercise of power, but we're surrounded by functional atheism that sometimes gets shaken up a little bit when something bad happens and then people suddenly start praying. The old Life magazine aphorism from World War II, there are no atheists in foxholes, right? Now, let's not make light of that, though, because I've certainly encountered a number of types of prayer in prisons. I've, thanks be to God, never been in a foxhole or combat for that matter. But people make light of prisoners' prayers and jailhouse conversions and say it's all about self-interest. Most of the prayers I've heard from somebody who's in the belly of the beast are quite sincere. It's like when somebody's trying to get sober. They may have said the prayer 50 times before, but when they're really in the depths of it, they are praying with their heart and soul. God hears these prayers, whether it's from a prison, a foxhole, a rehab ward, whatever it might be. We might think they are self-interested. All prayer at a certain level is self-interested, but it is sincere, so let's not denigrate it. What Wisdom of Solomon is pointing out here, though, is it's not chance, and therefore we have to do what? We have to pay attention. What is the pathway that God is putting before us? What this reading is basically focusing on is death is not something we need fear. Death is something that is part of life, and we are not separated from God by physical death. Now, going on to Psalm 30 here, we have an individual psalm of thanksgiving for deliverance from mortal illness. As one delivered from death, the psalmist invites others to join him in his praises of God. In Hebrew, there's a lot of linguistic parallelism going on here. So in verse 1, it says the psalmist will exalt God in thanksgiving, for God has exalted him, brought me up. We get sort of mirrors in Hebrew here. Brought him up from the shadow of death in verse 3. Verses 4 to 6 state a thought parallel to that found in Psalm 22, verses 23 through 24. One delivered from death is reintegrated into the worshiping community in joy. We're familiar with Psalm 22 from Good Friday and from the stripping of the altar on Maundy Thursday. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? The cry of dereliction on the cross. And all the things that the psalmist recites that are talking about the crucifixion. They pierce my hands and my feet. My bones are taken out of joint. They cast lots for my clothing. They give me vinegar to drink, things of that sort. But at the end of the psalm, there is redemption, and the psalmist is reintegrated into the community in order that he may lead praises. I have heard some people argue that the cry of dereliction from the cross is Jesus just starting to say Psalm 22 and he dies before he can get to the notes of praise. That would say it was random and that Jesus isn't in charge here. No, I think he's experiencing real dereliction. Remember what St. Anselm argues, that which is not assumed is not redeemed. And so Jesus, with the exception of sin, experiences every human condition, including despair and abandonment. What is it that we say in the Creed? He descended into hell. There is no human condition other than sin that Jesus has not experienced, and so we can offer it up. Now, telling somebody who's suffering terribly that what they can do is offer the suffering up to God, that they may participate in Jesus' redemption of the world, may be correct theologically. It doesn't fly very well pastorally. But I have seen people who've experienced terrible suffering for a very long time, and they get there. They get to the point where they start offering it up. And so if we are looking at examples like that, we come back to Paul saying, he will not test you beyond the grace he will give you. In 2 Corinthians here, chapter 8, we're in the midst of a fairly long argument Paul has been making with and to his problem children, the church in Corinth, who think it's all about what? Well, I'm special. I have special spiritual gifts. In fact, I'm more spiritual than you are, okay? Because I can talk in tongues. He's challenging them to move from eager acceptance of the idea of, let's raise money for the church in Palestine. We're going to be good people. How many times have you heard that sentiment in a church context, that we're going to do this out of the goodness of our hearts, right? Well, that's not really the way charity works, right? He's saying mental assent here has to be translated into action. Good intentions mean very little, particularly if they're not inspired by God. And if you don't do anything about it, well, feeling warm and fuzzy is kind of, besides the point. Paul reflects realistically on the situation in Corinth in chapter 6, mentioning his love for the Corinthians, not theirs for him, and in effect damning them with faint praise in his reference to the gifts of the Spirit that we'll get in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. Paul does not want to give the impression that he's making a demand. He later, in chapter 9, states the theology behind the act of giving, but right now he's advising them. He's not commanding them. The desire to act is more important than the failure experienced in Corinth, but now the desire has to be translated into action. Okay, so you had good intentions, you didn't do anything about it. Get over it, and now do it. Paul is actually a pretty good personnel manager here. He avoids direct criticism while engaging in motivation. He finishes this thought by making it clear that giving is on the basis of what one has. Apparently the Corinthians failed in their collection because they promised a great sum. We're special. We're Corinthians. We're the crossroads here. And we're going to give, I don't know, let's come up with a number. We're going to give a talent. And then they raise as far a smaller sum, and so think of this as a failure, and let's just move on. He's like, well, go back to your original intention, and now let's execute. Now, we can, of course, take this as an example to our own efforts, not so much in fundraising, although that certainly happens, as how we're going to be more spiritual. You know, I'm going to get up at 6 o'clock every morning and get out the prayer book and say the daily office, right? Most of us have gone through resolutions like that. Look at how New Year's resolutions work, right? What we find if we do in fact get up and say the daily office on a daily basis is that it becomes a discipline. And that if we don't exercise something as a discipline, we can always come up with a reason not to do it. One of the things we had to emphasize when we were working with what was called the Bishop's Mission Corps, which was for college-age students, living under a quasi form of the rule of St. Benedict, was on any given day, for any one of the offices, you can always come up with a reason to postpone it or not do it or make it up. And the only way to deal with that is that you always say it at the same time, no matter what's happening, no matter what you feel like, no matter who has had a bad night. You always do it at the same time. Monasteries have practiced this for thousands of years for a reason, because it works. And Paul is kind of making the same point to the Corinthians here. Let's get to practice. Paul finishes by quoting from chapter 16 in Exodus, but omits the verb to gather, which is supplied contextually. Now, let's look at Exodus just a minute. In our own day and age, we think of being a member of a church, right? Well, the word in both Hebrew and Greek for church, we don't have one for church per se in Hebrew, means assembly, gathering. There is no concept anywhere in the Bible of being a member of the church, unless you're actually assembled in worship. And so if you go to the Old Testament, you have the assembled people of Israel. So the idea that I'm going to have a letter on file somewhere in a church and say I'm a member of that church, and you know I send them a check every now and then, or I show up at Christmas and Easter, is completely foreign to a biblical worldview. You're a member because you're there in the worshiping community. And so when Paul is referring back to Exodus, he's talking about he's challenging the Corinthians about, don't act like you're part of the church if you're not showing up, if you're not gathered actually in the Lord's Supper and worship. Now, then we get to this complex story in the 5th chapter of Mark's Gospel. He shifts from the stilling of the sea, which we had last week, where you had the disciples saying what after Jesus commands the sea to be quiet? Who is this then who even commands the sea to be quiet? Well, connect the dots, folks, but they never do in Mark. They're clueless. The only people who figure Jesus out in Mark are outsiders who Jesus is revealed to. We have blind Bartimaeus, who greets him by a messianic title on the road outside Jericho in chapter 10. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. We have the demon in the country of the Gerasenes who says, I know who you are, Jesus of Nazareth. Have you come here to torment us? And who's the third one who says, truly this was the Son of God? The guy with the spear in the execution party, right? The centurion becomes St. Longinus. The disciples in Mark remain clueless. And so they say, who is this? And so we see the stilling of the sea, the exorcism of the Gerasene demoniac, healing the sick, raising the dead. Jesus is demonstrating his power in order to demonstrate who he is. Jesus has now returned to the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. And what's going to make it even more explicit, remember we don't have chapters and verses in the original manuscripts, right? What comes up right next in chapter 6? The feeding of the 5,000, where Jesus looks upon them as sheep without a shepherd, has them sit down, in what Mark describes as Aramon, a wilderness. In other words, a dry and deserty place, but they lie down on the green grass and are fed. So the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not. Jesus enacts the 23rd Psalm. He's demonstrating who he is. John makes this much more explicit because Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. I am the way, the truth, and the life, in the context of an act of power. Mark is not that direct. We have to figure it out from the story. But this one is what scholars refer to as a Markan sandwich. Don't try to order one at McAllister's, but it is a combination of two stories into one narrative, in which the stories share common elements and turn on a common hinge or center in the story. That's the peanut butter, okay? In the stories of the healing of the woman with the flow of blood and the raising of Jairus' daughter, the common points are female sufferers, the number 12, vocabulary, faith, fear, well, and daughter. And so we see two healings with a little bit of walking around in between, with people showing up and saying, hey, she's already dead, don't bother the teacher. Mark says that the little girl is at the point of dying. The other evangelists say that she's dead already. Jairus is the head of the synagogue, but begs Jesus. This is intended to show him as supplicant, even though he is one in authority. Jairus recognizes Jesus' power, just as the woman with the flow of blood did. Now, what's the problem with her touching Jesus under Levitical law? First of all, she's not under the protection of a man in public, and she's touching a man. Secondly, she is ritually unclean because she has a flow of blood and can't be around anybody. So she has really been doubly a victim. And here's another example of an outsider recognizing Jesus, who he is. If I but touch his garment, I will be made whole. So Jairus recognizes Jesus' power. So does the woman with the issue of blood. And this is a programmatic theme in Mark. The coming of Jesus as the one with power. What is it that he says? A couple weeks ago he said, you cannot plunder the strong man's house unless first the one who is stronger comes and binds him. And what's going to be made clear in Mark's gospel is that Jesus has come to earth to bind Satan. The one stronger has shown up. He's already exercised power over the sea and the air, over the demons. Now he exercises power over life and death. See how the narrative flows here. Matthew makes the same point in Matthew 12:29, quoting Jesus in the context of an exorcism to say that the one who comes to exercise power first binds the strong man. Jesus binds the devil, the powers of chaos in sea and sky, and the power of disease and death. And our story ends. And so just as we started out in the wisdom of Solomon saying, death is not eternal for those who believe. And Jesus tells us in his own words here, do not fear, only believe, and then demonstrates how that works. When we connect the dots here, we see a direct trajectory going on, which is why we're using track 2. Rather than, track 1 would have a completely different Old Testament lesson that would not relate at all to the gospel here. And the psalm wouldn't, and things like that. So there's an advantage to using track 2, I will argue yet again. Comments, questions? What did you hear that was new, or dots that you hadn't recognized before, or a reaction here?
Mark should be a podcaster. Detail-oriented.
Yeah, but he writes like a screenplay.
Yeah.
It very much entered Jesus' stage left, and immediately. That's his favorite word, immediately. Yeah?
And he told her to give them something to eat.
Right. He gets pretty practical.
She hasn't eaten.
Yeah. And give her something to eat. Now let's move on. I've got other people to see, Yes, he does not waste words. He doesn't sound... Here's the thing. When we studied Mark about a year ago, we went through Mark and Greek as a class on Tuesday nights. And we think of Mark as simple, sort of the proto-gospel, and what I found going through him line by line in detail, particularly Greek, there's a lot more sophisticated theology than we tend to give Mark credit for. We tend to kind of go to John and Luke. And Mark, he's got all that stuff, but you have to look at him from a different perspective and realize that he's running the film a lot faster, and you have to slow the film down in order to start focusing on some things. And then, of course, the wagon wheels start going backwards, and it's a problem. But so we're going to be in Mark for the entire season after Pentecost, and we'll get to pay more attention to what he has to say.